The Galactic Council Chamber floated in the space between worlds, and it was a place where many species came together to talk and make peace for 10,000 years now, but today something felt very wrong, and Ambassador Lyria Moonwhisper knew it. Deep in her bones, and she had walked these crystal halls for 300 years, and her silver hair still shined like starlight in her pointed ears. Could hear the smallest whisper from across the great room, and beside her in the shadows, her dragon companion Emberwing waited and watched with eyes that glowed like hot coals, and the dragon was small compared to the ancient ones, but she was fierce and loyal, and she had been with Lyria since she was just a hatchling the size of a catbutt. Today the human seat stood. It's completely empty, and this had never happened before in all the centuries. Lyria had served here, and it was not like the humans had left in a hurry, or forgotten to come, and there were no messages and no explanations. And it was as if humanity had simply vanished from the galaxy overnight, and their embassies across 40 different star systems were empty, and their ships were gone from every spaceport, and their colonies on the far rim worlds had been evacuated, down to the last child, and every single human signature in the vast galactic network had disappeared at exactly the same moment, and nobody knew why, and nobody had any. Answer Slaria stood near the observation window and looked out at the stars, and her violet eyes were filled with worry and concern because she had worked with humans for so long, and she knew them better than most Inhumans. Did not just run away, and they did not hide from problems, and they faced things head-on even when it was dangerous, and especially when others needed their help, and that was what made them special among all the species of the Council. And that was why everyone trusted them to solve disputes and mediate conflicts and keep the peace around her. The great chamber was filling with noise and anger and fear in the other. Ambassadors were starting to fight, and the Krovic delegation, with their dark scales and sharp teeth, were already threatening the Salian ambassadors, who had blue skin and gentle faces, and the trade guilds were breaking apart and forming new alliances, and old grudges that humans had helped bury were rising to the surface. Again, and without humanity's steady hand on the wheel, the whole council was like a ship in a storm with no captain, and Lyria could see it all falling apart right before her eyes. She placed her hand on Emberwing's neck and felt the warm scales under her fingers, and the dragon made a low rumbling sound deep in her chest, and smoke curled from her nostrils, and Emberwing had never trusted the other species the way Lyria did, and the dragon had always seen the jealousy in their eyes when humans spoke, and the resentment when human solutions worked better than their own ideas, and the dragon had warned Lyria many times that peace was fragile, and now that humanity was gone, the predators were showing their true face. Lyria whispered to her companion and said, "Something is very wrong here, and humans do not run away, and they do not abandon. They're friends, and if they left without telling anyone, then they left for a reason," and her blood ran cold as she thought about what that reason might be. And she had lived for 3 centuries and seen many strange things, but this frightened her more than anything else ever had, because if something scared humanity enough to make them disappear, then what chance did the rest of them have? Within just a few hours, the first weapons were fired, and the Krovic armada began moving toward Solian space, and they cited old grievances and ancient insults that humanity had once helped them resolve peacefully. But now, with no humans to stop them, they were ready for war, and the border worlds began to burn, and stations were destroyed, and innocent people died, and Lyria watched in horror as the council she had served for so long tore itself apart piece by piece. Tried to speak to the Krovic admiral, and she tried to reason with the Salian High Command, and she called emergency sessions and invoked ancient laws and protocols. But nobody would listen to an elf anymore, and without humans backing her words. She had no real power, and the other species had always respected humanity more than they respected her people. And now she understood why, and it was because humans had always been willing to fight when fighting was necessary, and elves preferred words and wisdom. But sometimes the galaxy needed more than just words. Emberwing grew restless and agitated, and the dragon paced back and forth in their quarters, and her size began to increase. And this was something that happened to dragons when they sensed war coming, and it was called rage growth, and it was an ancient survival mechanism. And within 2 days, Emberwing had grown from the size of a large dog to the size of a horse, and her copper scales gleamed brighter in her flames. Burned hotter, and she wanted to fight and protect her companion, but Lyria held her back because one dragon could not stop a galactic war, no matter how fierce she was. The third day after humanity vanished, Lyria made a decision, and she could not stop the war that was spreading across the galaxy, but she could try to find out why humans had left, and maybe if she understood the reason, she could make the others understand too, and maybe there was still hope. And so she prepared her personal ship, the Silver Thorn, for a long journey, and she filed the proper departure documents, and she told the council she was going to search for answers. Most of the ambassadors ignored her, and they were too busy with their own conflicts and plotting their own schemes, but a few looked at her with something like pity, and they thought she was chasing ghosts and wasting her time. But Lyria did not care what they thought, and she had to know the truth, and Emberwing felt the same way, and the dragon climbed into the cargo hold of the ship and curled up to wait for the journey to begin. As Lyria guided her ship away from the council station, she looked back one last time at the great crystal structure that had been the center of galactic civilization for so long, and she saw weapons fire in the distance and ships moving into battle formations, and she knew that by the time she returned, everything might be different, and the council might be completely destroyed. But she also knew that sitting and watching would accomplish nothing, and action was needed. Even if it was dangerous, she set course for Luna Station, which orbited the human home world, and it was the last place humans had been seen before they vanished. And if there were any clues or any messages, they would be there, and the journey would take several days, even at maximum speed. But Lyria was patient, and she had waited 300 years already, and she could wait a few more days, and besides, she needed time to think, and Planum Burwing came up from the cargo hold and squeezed into the cockpit beside her, and the dragon was getting too big for the small space. But she wanted to be near her companion, and Lyria scratched behind the dragon horns, the way Emberwing liked, and the dragon made a contented sound. And they sat together in comfortable silence as the stars streaked past the windows, and they traveled deeper into what had been human territory. The space around Earth was eerily quiet and empty, and there were no patrol ships and no trading vessels and no passenger liners, and all the normal traffic that should have filled this area was simply gone. And Lyria felt a chill run down her spine as she approached Luna Station, and the massive structure looked abandoned and dark, except for a few emergency lights. She packed her ship carefully and put on her environment suit, just in case, and Emberwing stayed close behind her as they entered the station, and the air was still breathable, and the life support systems were running on automatic, but there was nobody there, and the corridors echoed with their footsteps, and every door they opened revealed empty rooms and abandoned workstations and half-finished meals in the cafeteria. Lyria made her way to the central command center, and her heart was pounding, and she did not know what she would find. But when she entered the main control room, she saw something that made her stop and stare, and there on the central console was a small data chip, and it was marked with elven symbols that only she would recognize, and symbols that she had taught to a human friend many years ago when they had worked together on a peace treaty. Her hands trembled as she picked up the chip and inserted it into the console, and a hologram flickered to life in front of her, and it showed a human woman with short dark hair and tired eyes, and she wore a military uniform, and her name tag said Commander Kate Morrison, and Lyria recognized her from various council meetings, though they had never worked together. Directly, Kate Image spoke, and her voice was calm but strained, and she said, "If you are watching this, Lyria, then you came looking for answers, and I am sorry we could not tell you before, and I am sorry we had to leave without explaining, but the Accord would not allow it, and we had no choice." And Lyria leaned forward, because the Accord was humanity. Mysterious governing body, and nobody outside humanity knew much about them. Kate continued and explained that 16 months ago, human deep space sensors detected something beyond the galactic rim, and it was an intelligence, and it was ancient, and it was ancient, and it was hostile, and it had been sleeping for millions of years, but human expansion had woken it up, and now it was coming, and it fed on conflict, and it grew stronger with every war and every fight. And it had been watching the council and studying all the species and waiting for the right moment to Tecleria felt sick as she listened, and this explains so much. And Kate said that the entity was targeting the council through. The Kravik war fleet stretched across space like a dark river of metal and fury, and there were 300 vessels in total, and each one bristled with weapons and hatred, and at the center of this armada was the flagship Vengeance, and on its bridge stood Grand Admiral Vector, and he was a creature of black scales and burning eyes, and he had waited 200 years for this moment, and now finally without humans to stop him. He would crush the Saulians and take their wealthy worlds, and prove that the Kravik were the strongest species in the galaxy. Vector stood before the tactical display and watched his forces move into position, and soon they would cross into Saulian space, and the killing would begin, and he smiled, showing rows of sharp teeth because he remembered every insult and every slight the Saulians had ever given his people, and humans had always forced peace and forced compromise. But now there were no humans, and now there would only be victory. But then something appeared on his sensors that made him pause, and it was a small ship, and just one single vessel flying directly toward his entire fleet, and it was suicide, and it was madness. And when his weapons officer identified the ship as belonging to Ambassador Lyria Moonwhisper, he laughed because what could one elf do against 300 warships? Lyria broadcast on all frequencies, and her voice was clear and strong, and she said, "Admiral Vector, I invoke the right of parley under the ancient codes, and you will hear me, or you will mark yourself as honorless before all the galaxy." And her words echoed across every ship in the fleet, and Vector stopped laughing because the ancient codes were older than the council itself, and they came from a time when honor meant something, and to refuse parley when it was properly invoked would unite every other species against him. He growled deep in his throat, and his claws scraped against the armrest of his command chair, and he wanted to ignore her and continue with his attack, but his officers were watching, and his crew was listening, and if he broke the ancient codes now, he would lose their respect, and without respect, he could not lead. And so he snarled into the communication system and said, "You have 5 minutes, elf, and make them count, or I will blast you from space. Illyria, ship the silver." Thorn hung in the void between the fleets, and she had positioned herself deliberately in the open, where any weapon could destroy her in seconds. And on the hull of her ship, Emberwing perched like a living statue, and the dragon had grown even larger, and now she was nearly 20 meters from nose to tail, and her copper scales caught the light of distant stars and reflected it like fire. And every Kravik who saw her remembered the old stories about dragons and about the destruction they could cause. Illyria began to speak, and she said, "You believe humanity abandoned you, and you believe their departure is weakness, and you think this is your opportunity, but you are wrong. And Admiral Vector, you are making a terrible mistake in humanity, left to protect us from something none of you can imagine. And while they are out there fighting in the darkness, you fools are destroying exactly what they died to save." She transmitted data to every ship in the fleet, and it was astronomical information and sensor readings and pattern analysis, and it showed strange signals coming from beyond the galactic rim, and it showed energy signatures that did not match any known technology, and it showed something vast moving through the void and growing stronger. And Vector studied the data with his tactical mind, and he did not want to believe it, but the numbers did not live. Lyria continued and said, "There is something out there in the deep dark, and it feeds on conflict, and it grows powerful from war, and every shot you fire and every world you burn makes it stronger and draws it closer to us, and humanity discovered this thing 16 months ago, and they tried to warn the Accord, but the entity was watching and studying us and using our conflicts to learn about us, and so humanity did the only thing they could, and they vanished to make the entity think they were." Gona Vector wanted to dismiss her words as lies, but the data was compelling, and his science officers were already analyzing it and confirming that the readings were genuine, and he leaned back in his chair and said, "Even if I believed you, elf, the Solians would never agree to peace, and they hate us as much as we hate them, and this changes nothing." But Lyria smiled and said, "The Solians have already agreed to a ceasefire, and I spoke with them first before coming to you, and they remember that. Humans never lied to them, and they are willing to trust that memory even now. and she paused for effect and said, "The question is, Admiral, are the Krovik brave enough to do the same, or are you too afraid?" It was a perfect challenge, and Lyria had phrased it as a test of courage rather than a plea for mercy, and Vector felt his pride stir because no Krovik could back down from such a challenge without losing face, and Emberwing chose that moment to roar, and the sound traveled through space as the vibration that every hull felt and every crew member heard, and it reminded them all that dragons were among the most feared creatures in the galaxy for very good reasons. The Bridge of the Vengeance was silent, and every officer waited for Vector decision, and he could feel their eyes on him, and he knew that whatever he chose now would define his legacy, and he thought about the data Lyria had shown him, and he thought about humanity's strange disappearance, and he thought about his own hatred for the Seleans, and finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke. He said, 48 hours, and prove your claims, Elf, and show me. This threat is real, or we finish what we started, and I will not wait longer than that." And Lyria bowed her head in acknowledgement and said, "That is all I ask, Admiral." And then her ship turned and flew away. And Emberwing spread her wings and launched from the hull and flew alongside the Silver Thorn like an escort as they traveled back toward neutral space. Emberwing mental voice touched Lyria mind and said, "That bought us time, but not much." And Lyria replied, "Time is all humanity asked for, and now we give them more." And she set course for the coordinates Kate had given her, and she hoped desperately that she would find humanity fleet and find answers and find a way to save the galaxy from tearing itself apart. The journey took 3 days, and the region of space the coordinates pointed to was not on any official maps, and it was a place where stars died young and massive nebula clouds swallowed light, and Lyria's sensors screamed warnings at her and told her to turn back. But Emberwing instincts guided them forward, and dragons could navigate by cosmic currents that no instrument could measure and no science could explain. They found humanity fleet hiding in the shadow of a collapsed star in Lyria. Breath caught in her throat when she saw it, and there were dozens of human vessels running dark and silent, and they had been modified and rebuilt for long-term survival in deep space, and defense platforms surrounded them and watched the darkness beyond, and at the heart of the fleet was a massive carrier that dwarfed anything the Council possessed. She transmitted her identity codes and waited, and after a tense minute she received permission to dock, and as her ship entered the carrier hangar bay, she saw human crews working and soldiers standing guard, and all of them looked tired and worn but determined, and they had been fighting out here alone while the galaxy forgot about them. Kate Morrison met her at the airlock, and the commander looked older now, and there were new scars on her face, and she wore her uniform like armor in behind. Eyes had seen too much death and too much horror, and Lyria felt a wave of respect and sorrow for these humans who had sacrificed everything. It led her to the command center, and Emberwing followed, and the dragon had to squeeze through corridors that were not built for creatures her size, but nobody tried to stop her, and the humans understood that the elf and dragon were bonded and could not be separated, and in the command center, Kate showed Lyria something that made her blood freeze. In her veins and the walls were tactical displays and sensor readouts, and they showed a massive dark shape stretching across multiple star systems, and it looked like a storm that had been given form and consciousness, and it pulsed with alien intelligence. And tendrils of dark energy reached out towards civilized space like the arms of something drowning and hungry. Kate said quietly, "We call it the Devourer, and it has been asleep for millions of years in the space between galaxies in our expansion. Woke it, and our conflicts feed it, and if it reaches the Council, there will be nothing left." And she did not need to say more because Lyria could see the terrible truth in the data. Before her, Lyria whispered, "How do you fight something like that?" And Kate smiled, but there was no humor in it, and she said carefully, "And we have been attacking its edges and disrupting its feeding patterns and learning its weaknesses, and it is drawn to psychic energy, and especially the kind generated by war. And fear and negative emotions, and humanity gift was always unity, and we do not fight among ourselves the way other species do, and that made us less interesting to it and less tasty." Emberwing growled low, and the dragon understood because her kind had fought similar entities in ages past before the younger races had even learned to use tools, and dragons remembered The old wars and the old darkness and the ancient battles that had shaped the galaxy, Kate continued and said, "But we cannot kill it alone, and we need the Council united. And we need every species working together with all their technology and all their weapons and everything humanity worked for." The human fleet moved through space like a school of fish swimming toward a storm, and there were 47 vessels in total, and each one had been modified with weapons and shields that humanity had developed specifically to fight the Devourer. And these were not standard Council weapons, but something new and desperate and born from months of trial and error and paid for with blood and sacrifice. And Kate Morrison stood on the bridge of the carrier Defiance and watched her fleet form up, and she knew that some of these ships would not return, and some of these crews would not see another sunrise. But this was the price of protecting the Galaxilaria. Stood beside Kate and watched through the massive view screen as they approached the edge of the dark zone, and that was what humans called the region, where the Devourer presence was strongest and behind them. Emberwing had taken position on the carrier hull, and the dragon had grown to her full war size now, and she was 50 meters long, and her scales burned like molten metal, and she was ready to fight and ready to burn anything that threatened her companion. The Devourer appeared on their sensors first as a distortion, and then as a shadow, and then as something that hurt to look at, and it was like staring into a hole in reality, and the tendrils that reached out from its main body were each larger than a planet, and they moved with purpose and intelligence, and where they touched, space itself seemed to die, and stars went dark, and energy was absorbed and matter dissolved into nothing. Kate spoke calmly into the fleet communication system and said, "All ships, this is Morrison, and you know the plan, and you know what we are facing, and we are not here to win today, and we are here to show the Council that this threat is real, and we are here to prove that humanity did not abandon them, and we are here to buy time for the galaxy to prepare." And she paused and then said, "It has been an honor serving with you all, and humanity will remember what you do here." The fleet acknowledged, and Lyria felt a chill run down her spine, because these humans knew they were flying into hell, and they did it anyway, and they did it without hesitation. And that was what made humanity special, and that was what the Council had lost when humans vanished and Emberwing roared, and the sound carried across the communication channels, and it was a dragon challenge to the darkness, and a promise that this fight would be remembered. The battle began when the first human destroyer fired its quantum torpedoes, and the weapon struck a Devourer tendril, and there was a flash of light, and the tendril recoiled, and the darkness screamed, "Ah!" And it was a sound that had no physical form, but every crew member felt it in their minds and bones, and it was the sound of something ancient and hungry and angry, and the tendril lashed out like a whip and struck the destroyer. And the ship hull began to corrode and dissolve, and the crew managed to evacuate in escape pods before their vessel became dust more. Ships opened fire, and the space lit up with weapons, fire and explosions, and humanity had learned that conventional weapons did almost nothing to the Devourer, but quantum technology and antimatter could hurt it and could push it back temporarily, and so the fleet used everything they had and poured fire into the darkness, and the entity responded with violence that was beyond anything Lyria had ever seen. A tendril wrapped around a human cruiser and squeezed, and the ship shields held for 3 seconds and then collapsed, and the hull crumpled like paper, and another tendril swept through a formation of frigates, and 2 of them managed to dodge. But the third was caught, and it simply ceased to exist, as if it had never been there at all. And Lyria broadcast everything back to the Council, and she made sure every species could see what humanity was fighting and what they had been fighting. Alone from Munskate coordinated the fleet with cold precision, and she ordered ships to fall back when they were damaged, and she sent fresh units forward, and she used every trick and tactic that humans had learned through painful experience. And the fleet danced around the Devourer tendrils and struck and retreated and struck again, and it was like watching someone fight a hurricane with a knife. But humans did not give up, and did not stop. Pomberwing launched from the carrier hull and flew into the battle, and Lyria rode between the dragon wings and held on tight, and together they carved through space faster than any ship, and the EHIP dragon breathed plasma that burned at temperatures that could scar even the devourer essence and wherever. Emberwing flew the darkness, pulled back, and ancient magic that elves had nearly forgotten flared around them and made physics negotiable for brief moments. They flew past human ships that were venting atmosphere and past wreckage that had once been proud vessels and past escape pods carrying survivors, and Lyria used her centuries of tactical experience to coordinate targeting data, and she sent information to Kate and to the fleet commanders, and she marked weak points in the devourer structure and indicated where concentrated fire might do the most damage. Dendril lashed toward them, and Emberwing rolled and dove and climbed, and the dragon was faster than the darkness and more maneuverable, and the tendril missed by meters. And then the dragon turned and breathed fire, and the plasma struck the tendril and burned a line across its surface, and the entity screamed again and pulled back slightly, and Lyria felt a surge of fierce pride because they were hurting it and proving it could be fought. Kate's voice came through the communication system and said, "Lyria, we are arming the quantum bomb, and we need 10 more minutes to charge it. Can you keep the tendrils away from the carrier?" And Lyria replied, "We will hold." Them and she guided Emberwing into position, and the dragon understood, and together they became a living shield between the devourer and humanity's last hope. The tendrils came at them from multiple directions, and Emberwing flew patterns that would have been impossible for any ship, and the dragon breathed fire in streams that lit up the darkness, and Lyria used ancient elven words of power that she had not spoken in 2 centuries, and together they held the line, and behind them the carrier. Defiance held position, and the quantum bomb charged slowly, and human engineers worked desperately to complete the arming sequence. More ships died, and more crews evacuated, and the space around them was filled with debris and fire and the screams of dying vessels, and Lyria saw a human captain deliberately ram his damaged destroyer into a devourer tendril to buy time for a medical ship to escape, and she saw a group of frigates form a defensive wall around evacuation transports and hold position even as the darkness consumed them one by one, and she understood finally what humanity had been doing out here in the deep dark, and they had been sacrificing everything to protect people who thought they had been abandoned. The quantum bomb reached full charge, and Kate transmitted to the entire fleet and said, "All ships get clear and maximum burn away from the detonation point, and we have 60 seconds. And Lyria started to pull Emberwing back, but then she saw the Kate carrier was still too close, and the Defiance had taken damage, and its engines were not at full power. And if the bomb went off now, the flagship would be caught in the blast. Radius Lyria made a decision without thinking, and she said, "Emberwing maximum power," and grab that ship and get it clear, and the dragon roared acknowledgement and dove toward the massive carrier and extended her claws and grabbed the hull, and physics protested, but ancient dragon magic made it possible, and Emberwing pulled and pushed and flew faster than light for 3 impossible seconds, and the strain was enormous, and Lyria could feel her companion pain and exhaustion, but the dragon did not stop. Kate's voice came through, panicked, and said, "Lyria, get clear, the blast radius is too large and you cannot make it." And Lyria replied, "Then we all die together, or we all live," and she poured her own elven magic into Emberwing and gave the dragon strength, and together they dragged the massive carrier away from the detonation point, and behind them, the quantum bomb counted down and reached 0. Explosion was like watching reality tear itself apart, and a wave of quantum energy expanded outward and struck the Abera tendril, and the darkness screamed and writhed. And the tendril was severed from the main body and sealed away and cut off, and the entity pulled back its remaining limbs and retreated deeper into the dark zone, and for the first time in this long war, humanity had hurt it badly enough to make it flee. The shockwave caught Emberwing and Lyria, and they tumbled through space, and the dragon wrapped her wings around her companion to protect her, and they hit the side of another human ship and bounced off and finally came to rest, floating in the void. And Lyria was dizzy and disoriented, but alive, and Emberwing was exhausted and smoking but breathing, and around them the human fleet regrouped and counted their losses. Kate's voice came through shaky with emotion and said, "Lyria, you saved Us and you did not have to do that, and Lyria replied, yes, I did, because that is what friends do, and friends fight together, and friends protect each other. And Kate was silent for a moment, and then said, welcome to the fleet, Ambassador, and let us go home. The journey back to civilized space took 2 days, and gave the survivors time to repair damage and treat wounded, and mourn the dead. And Lyria spent most of that time in the medical bay with Emberwing, and the dragon had pushed herself beyond her limits and needed rest, but she would recover, and the human doctors treated her with respect and gratitude, because everyone had seen what the dragon and her rider had done. The War Council met in the largest chamber the station had, and representatives from 47 species crowded around holographic displays that showed the Devourer spreading slowly but inevitably towards civilized space, and humanity had bought them time with their sacrifice, but time was running out, and everyone in that room knew it, and the air was thick with tension and fear, but also with determination, because for the first time in galactic history, every species was truly united against a common enemy. Kate Morrison stood at the center podium and presented humanity tactical analysis, and she showed what worked against the Devourer and what did not, and she explained that conventional weapons were useless, but quantum technology and antimatter and certain exotic energy frequencies could damage it, and more importantly, she showed that the entity fed on conflict and negative emotions, and that its unity and cooperation actually weakened it and made it less able to adapt. And this meant that keeping the peace was not just politically important, but strategically vital. Admiral Vector, the Kravik stood, and his voice was different now, without the hatred it once carried, and he said, humanity has shown us how to fight, and the Kravik fleet will stand with you. And we offer our warriors and our ships and our manufacturing capacity. In there was a murmur of approval, and then the Solian High Chancellor stood and said her people would contribute their advanced shield technology and their medical expertise, and one by one every species made pledges and promises. Lyria watched it all and felt something she had not felt in 300 years, and it was hope, and real hope, not just wishful thinking. And beside her, Emberwing had recovered enough to attend the council, and the dragon presence reminded everyone of what they were capable of when they worked together, and reminded them that legends could become real if people were brave enough to fight. Kate looked at the assembled representatives and said, we need to do more than just defend, and we need to take the fight to the Devourer before it reaches our populated systems and humanity. It's been studying this entity for months, and we believe its core is located deep in the dark zone, and if we can strike that core with enough force, we might be able to kill it permanently, or at least drive it back into dormancy. And she paused and said, but it will require the largest combined fleet the galaxy has ever assembled, and many of us will not return. The room fell silent, and everyone understood what she was asking, and this was not just a military operation, but a suicide mission for some. And yet as Lyria looked around, she saw no fear in the faces staring back at Kate, and she saw only resolve and acceptance, because they all knew that if they did not do this, their children and grandchildren would face something even worse, and so they would pay the price now and hope it was enough. The planning took 3 weeks, and during that time, the greatest military minds from every species worked together, and Lyria had never seen such cooperation. And the Kravik shared their weapons technology, and the Salians opened their research databases, and the trade guilds provided logistics support, and even species that had been enemies for centuries put aside their differences and worked as one. Emberwing spent her time with the other dragons that had been summoned from across the galaxy, and there were 12 in total, and some were ancient creatures who had not flown in battle for millennia, and they gathered in secret and spoke in the old language and made plans of their own, because dragons understood this kind of enemy better than anyone, and they remembered the wars before history. Kate found Lyria in the observation deck one night, and the elf was staring out at the stars, and Kate sat beside her and was quiet for a moment, and then said, I never thought we would make it this far, and I thought we would die alone out there in the dark, and no one would ever know what we tried to do. And Lyria replied, but you did not die, and we know now, and we will fight with you. And Kate smiled sadly and said, I just hope it is enough. The combined fleet assembled at the edge of council space, and it was the largest gathering of military power in galactic history, and there were over 3,000 vessels from 47 different species, and each one flew their own colors, but they all fought under a new banner that humanity had designed, and it showed all the species together facing the darkness, and it had no words, but everyone understood what it meant. Laria commanded a small task force of fast-strike ships, and her role was to identify weak points in the Devourer defenses and coordinate dragon strikes. And Emberwing would carry her into battle, and the dragon was eager to fight again, and this time she would not fight alone, because the other dragons would fly with her, and together they would remind the universe why their kind was fear. The fleet jumped into the dark zone, and space itself seemed wrong here, and sensors gave false readings, and navigation was difficult, and the darkness pressed against ship hulls like a physical presence, and Lyria could feel the wrongness of this place, and it made her skin crawl. But she pushed the feeling aside and focused on her mission. They found the Devourer waiting for them, and it had grown larger since the last battle, and its tendrils now stretched across entire star systems, and its core pulsed with dark energy that made instruments scream warnings. And Kate's voice came through the fleet communication system, calm and steady, and she said, "All ships execute attack plan Alpha and show this thing what unity looks like." The battle began, and it was nothing like the skirmish before. And this was total war on a scale that no living being had ever witnessed. And 3,000 ships opened fire simultaneously, and the space lit up with weapons of every type, and quantum torpedoes and antimatter missiles and plasma cannons and exotic energy beams, and all of it focused on the Devourer tendrils, and the entity screamed and lashed out. Ships died in the first minute, and dozens of vessels were caught by the tendrils and crushed or dissolved, but for every ship that fell, 10 more took its place, and the fleet pressed forward, and humanity. Quantum bombs detonated and severed tendrils, and Kravik battlecruisers rammed through the gaps, and Salian medical ships evacuated wounded, and everyone played there. Partimber Wing launched with the other dragons, and 12 ancient creatures flew into the heart of darkness, and they breathed fire that burned with magic older than stars, and wherever they flew, the Devourer pulled back, because dragons carried within them the essence of creation itself, and the entity was a thing of void and destruction, and the two forces were opposed at a fundamental level. Iria rode her dragon and coordinated strikes, and she marked targets and sent data to the fleet, and her centuries of experience made her perfect for this role, and she saw patterns in the chaos and understood where to strike for maximum effect, and Kate trusted her judgment and followed her recommendations, and together the elf and the human commander orchestrated a symphony of destruction. But the Devourer was learning and adapting, and it began to predict their movements and counter their tactics, and tendrils that had been severed grew back stronger, and the entity core remained protected behind layers of dark energy that nothing could penetrate. And the fleet casualties mounted, and Lyria began to fear they would fail despite all their preparation and all their courage. Then the ancient dragons did something unexpected, and they flew in formation toward the Devourer core, and they began to sing, and it was a sound that had not been heard in the galaxy for millions of years, and it was the song of creation, and it resonated with the fundamental frequencies of reality itself. And where the song touched the darkness, it weakened and dispersed. Bergen joined the song, and her voice was young compared to the others, but strong and pure, and Lyria felt the magic flowing through her companion, and she added her own voice and sang the old elven songs of light. And other species heard the singing, and they did not understand the words, but they felt the power, and they pushed harder and fought fiercer. The Devourer core became visible, and it was a wound in space itself, and a hole where reality ended. And Kate saw the opening and ordered the fleet to concentrate all fire on that single point, and every weapon that could reach fired at once. And the combined power of 3,000 ships struck the core simultaneously. Explosion was beyond description, and reality itself seemed to crack, and the Devourer screamed, and the sound echoed across dimensions and every sentient being in the galaxy felt it for just a moment. And then the entity began to collapse inward, and its tendrils dissolved, and its presence faded in space. Slowly returned to normal, but the cost had been terrible, and over 800 ships were gone, and thousands of crew members had died, and every vessel that survived was damaged, and the fleet limped back toward Council space, battered and broken, but victorious, and they had done what no one thought possible, and they had killed a god. Lyria and Emberwing flew among the survivors and helped coordinate rescue operations, and the dragon was exhausted and bleeding from wounds that would take months to heal, but she did not stop working, and Lyria was the same, and together they saved lives and gave hope, and showed everyone that the battle was worth the price. Kate stood on the bridge of the Defiance and looked at the casualty reports, and she felt the weight of every death and wondered if she had made the right choices. And then Lyria appeared beside her, and the elf placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "You gave them a galaxy to live in, and that is worth dying for." And the memorial ceremony took place on a newly constructed station at the edge of the Dark Zone where the final battle had been fought. And it was a massive structure built by all 47 species working together, and at its center was a monument made of crystal and metal that listed every name of every person who had died fighting the Devourer, and the list was long and painful to read, but necessary because those who had fallen deserved to be remembered. For Valeria stood before the monument, with Emberwing beside her, and the dragon had healed slowly over the past 3 months, but she would carry scars for the rest of her life, and so would everyone else who had survived. And Kate Morrison stood on her other side wearing a formal uniform and looking older than her years, but also somehow more at peace. And around them, thousands of beings from every species gathered to pay their respects. The ceremony began with silence, and everyone stood quietly for 10 minutes and thought about those they had lost in Lyria, thought about the human crews who had fought alone in the darkness for so long, and about the Kravic warriors who had put aside centuries of hatred, and about the Salian medics who had died trying to save others, and about all the brave souls who had given everything so the galaxy could live. Then Kate stepped forward and spoke, and her voice was transmitted across every world and every station, and she said, "We gather here not to celebrate victory, but to honor sacrifice, and the beings whose names are written on this monument came from different worlds and different cultures, and they spoke different languages and believed different things, but they all understood one truth, and that truth is that some things are worth dying for." And she paused and looked at the crowd and said, "And they believed that you were worth dying for." There was not a dry eye in the assembly, and even Admiral Vector, who was not known for showing emotion, had tears running down his scaled face, and the Selayan High Chancellor openly wept. And Lyria felt her own tears fall, and she was not ashamed, because grief shared was grief lessened, and everyone here understood that they were part of something larger than themselves. After the ceremony, there was a council meeting, and this one was different from all the others, because humanity was no longer just participants, but acknowledged leaders, and Kate had been offered the position of Supreme Military Commander, and she had accepted with the understanding that every species would have equal say in how forces were deployed and used, and this was a new kind of leadership built on trust rather than domination. Lyria had been offered a position as well, and she was now the chief diplomatic coordinator, and her job was to make sure that the unity forged in battle did not dissolve in peace. And it was a difficult role, because old habits died hard, and some species still had grudges and conflicts, but everyone was trying, and that was what mattered. And Emberwing often accompanied her to meetings, because the dragon presence reminded everyone what they could accomplish together. The council also made a decision that surprised many, and they voted to establish a permanent joint fleet that would patrol the Dark Zone and watch for any signs that the Devourer might return, and they called it the Unity Fleet, and every species contributed ships and crews, and it was commanded by rotating officers so that no single species held too much power, and Kate oversaw the whole operation and made sure it remained true to its purpose. Humanity began to return to their old worlds and colonies, but they were changed by their time in the deep dark, and they no longer saw themselves as mediators standing between other species, but as part of a larger family, and they shared their technology more freely and opened their borders wider, and they remembered that isolation had nearly cost them everything. Lyria visited Earth for the first time, and it was a beautiful blue world full of life and diversity, and she walked through human cities and saw how they lived, and she understood better why humanity had fought so hard to protect the galaxy, and they saw every world as precious and every life as valuable, and that philosophy had shaped everything they did, and it was a lesson the other species were slowly learning. One day, Kate found Lyria in a garden on the council station, and the elf was sitting beneath a tree with Emberwing curled up beside her, and the dragon was sleeping peacefully, and Kate sat down and said, "I wanted to thank you properly, and without you none of this would have been possible, and you believed in us when you had every reason not to." And Lyria smiled and said, "I believed because I knew humans, and I knew they would never abandon people who needed them." Kate was quiet for a moment, and then said, "What will you do now? And the war is over, and your job is mostly managing the peace." And Lyria replied, "I will do what I have always done, and I will serve the council, and try to make the galaxy a better place, and besides, Emberwing would be bored without important work to do." And the dragon opened one eye and snorted smoke. In agreement, Kate laughed and said, "Humanity is building something new, and we are calling it the Academy of Unity, and it will be a place where beings from all species can come and learn and train together. And we want to make sure that future generations understand what was sacrificed and what was won." And she looked at Lyria hopefully and said, "We would like you to teach there and share your knowledge and help shape the leaders of tomorrow." Lyria thought about it and looked at Emberwing. In the dragon mental voice said, "It is a good idea, and we have lived through history, and now we can help others understand it." And Lyria nodded and said, "Yes, I will teach, and I will make sure no one forgets what happened here and what it cost." And Kate smiled with relief and said, "Thank you, and the galaxy needs wisdom like yours." The months passed and turned into years, and the Unity fleet remained vigilant, and the Dark Zone stayed quiet, and slowly people began to believe that the Devourer was truly gone, and life returned to something like normal. Except that normal was better now because the species worked together in ways they never had before, and trade flourished and science advanced, and art and culture were shared. Free Lyria taught at the academy, and her students came from every world and every background, and she told them stories about the war and about humanity, sacrifice, and about the importance of unity. And she showed them Emberwing scars and explained that some wounds never fully heal, but they remind us of what we survived and what we must never forget. Burdenbore Wing became something of a legend among the younger generations, and children from all species wanted to meet the dragon who had fought beside humanity. And Emberwing was patient with them and sometimes gave rides to the brave ones. And Lyria watched her companion interact with these younglings and felt pride because the dragon was teaching them courage and compassion without even realizing it. Kate visited the academy often, and she and Lyria became close friends. And they would sit together in the evenings and talk about the old days and about the future, and sometimes they would argue about policy or strategy, but it was always with respect and understanding, and they both knew that their friendship represented something important, and it was proof that different species could not just coexist, but thrive together. One evening 5 years after the war ended, Lyria stood on a balcony overlooking the academy grounds and watched students from a dozen different species training together and laughing together and learning together, and she felt Emberwing presence in her mind. And the dragon said, "We did well?" And Lyria replied, "Yes, we did. And the galaxy is better for what we fought." For Kate joined them and looked out at the same view and said, "Humanity almost gave up hope out there in the dark, and we thought we would die unknown and unmourned, but you found us, and you reminded us that we were not alone." And Lyria put her hand on Kate's shoulder and said, "And you reminded the galaxy what it means to be truly brave and to sacrifice for others." They stood together in comfortable silence and watched the sun set over the academy. And in the distance they could see the memorial station where the monument to the fallen stood eternal, and Emberwing spread her wings and stretched. And the dragon said, "There will be other threats and other challenges, and we must remain ready." And both Kate and Lyria nodded because they knew it was true, but for now there was peace, and there was unity, and there was hope, and the galaxy had learned that working together made them stronger than the sum of their parts, and that lesson would endure even when those who had fought in the war were gone, and new generations would carry the torch forward. Lyria to Kate and said, "Do you ever regret how things turned out?" And Kate thought for a moment and said, "No, because we saved countless lives and proved that unity is not just a dream but a reality, and that is worth everything we lost." And Lyria agreed and said, "And we made friends along the way, and that might be the most important thing of a loss." Night fell over the academy. The three of them remained on the balcony and talked about plans for the future, and about new initiatives, and about the students they were training, and about the galaxy they were building together. And Emberwing listened and occasionally offered her thoughts, and the dragon was content because her companion was happy, and that was all that mattered to her. Years later, when historians wrote about the Great War against the Devourer, they would focus on the battles and the tactics and the pactics and the technology. But those who had lived through it knew that the real story was about something simpler and more profound. And it was about an elf who refused to give up on her friends